Now, a brief introduction of our friend from USA, whose first introduction will be that he is in great demand in Lucknow. In the 3 days he has been here. And the credit for that goes to our friend Madhuri Kukreja of Sanat Dada, who first brought him into limelight here in Lucknow. And we all listened to him. And that's how it took off, and then from us to university and God knows where else it has gone. Now, Richard Winfield is a scholar. He grew up in New York and in its suburbs before attending college at Yale. Yale, as you know, is one of the top 5 or 6 universities of the world, including USA. And I have a little personal interest also because my son-in-law is also from Yale. So I would know for sure that it's a place of high learning. He was always interested in philosophy. And the interest further took hold as life moved on. After studying in both Paris and Heidelberg, he returned to Yale for his philosophy PhD and did it from there. After graduating, he spent 5 years seeking a full-time teaching position and is presently teaching in the University of Georgia in Athens. While in his early stages of life, he met his lady love, Sujata, who's with us here, sitting right here. And while you may not understand, but she'll understand that Mohabbat Parwan Chadi, and then they got married. So that's how they started. They got children. One of the children is working in India. He's not been able to come because he's doing his offices now. He has 3 children. Yeah. And he has already written 19 books, and the 20th is about to be completed. He is coming to Lucknow despite having wife connection. He's coming to India, am I right? After 25 years. No.
Lucknow is coming after.
Oh, Lucknow you're coming after 25
India
years.
every year.
He used to come every year
Yeah.
to Calcutta. Is it so?
And Lucknow is making full use of his visit after 25 years. And we welcome him to his talk on challenges of democracy in USA and India. And we will be thrilled to hear this talk because all of us were, because none of us would think that there is a similarity between USA and India. But he's be able to tell you how and what is the diversities also, and also the new social order in the making. So I request Richard, please come and start his address.
Thank you. I want to give a very different talk tonight from the one I gave at Sanat Dada. And I want to focus in particular on the challenges to business and what is involved in giving capitalism a human face. I think we're all aware that in the last several decades, a position has come to be more and more embraced by governments around the world. A position that had earlier fallen into disfavor. And it's a position that takes the view that the economy, the market should be let as free as possible, that government should avoid nationalizing commerce and industry, it should reduce its regulations, tariff barriers should be reduced, both domestically and internationally. Free trade and something akin to a laissez-faire economics should prevail. The ideological emissary of this view is Friedrich Hayek, the 20th century Austrian economist and social thinker and Nobel Prize winner. And his view, which he expressed in his well-known book, The Road to Tyranny, his view was that the economy and market relations should be left as unencumbered as possible for two reasons. One is that if one followed the path of many modern regimes, and he had in mind Nazi Germany above all, the path of allowing the state to take hold and actively manage the economy. This would lead, on the one hand, to infringements of individual liberty, and on the other hand, it would sap economic dynamism. As far as he was concerned, government should restrict itself to upholding person and property and providing an administration of civil law. Government should admittedly step in to provide people with the fundamental biological needs without which, or I should say, the biological needs of individuals should be met, and no one should be allowed to starve or die of exposure. But beyond that, government should do nothing other than protect person and property. And the only other kinds of interventions in market activity that are to be tolerated are measures to restrain the formation of monopolies. And that would be regarded as a way of protecting the free workings of the market. Now, in some respect, one can say that the emergence of the market and the new capitalist economy in the 17th and 18th centuries was something against which society had to then react and in some respect protect itself. Because it became evident that free enterprise in and of itself would make use of such things as slavery, child labor. It would have unsafe working conditions. It would despoil the environment. It would pay different groups unequal wages. It would produce products that were not reliable and safe. And in some respect, if the market were left to its own, fundamental rights pertaining to both the family and the very social autonomy of individuals might be jeopardized. And in some respect, this raised an ethical dilemma for entrepreneurs. Many business schools have courses in business ethics, but I think the fundamental principle of business ethics is not something that they cover. And I'd like to propose that it is the following. And it is that entrepreneurs cannot be both ethical and competitive unless their activities are subject to a public regulation that requires all businesses to operate in ways that meet the ethical standards that uphold the freedoms of individuals. As an entrepreneur, you always face the dilemma in an unregulated market, where if you were to choose to pay your employees decent wages, to give them flexible hours, to protect the environment, to develop safe products, to advertise honestly, you may very well put yourself at a competitive disadvantage against the more unscrupulous competitors who operate in a way that is meaner and leaner and are able to undercut you in price, the product, and so forth. So in a way, the only way in which entrepreneurs are going to be able to be ethical and to take measures that may involve added expense is if these measures are required of all entrepreneurs. In that case, these ethical standards to which business ought to comply are mandated for all entrepreneurs as conditions for doing business, and complying with them involves no type of competitive disadvantage whatsoever. Now, I've been working in the academy for many years as a philosophy professor. After the elections of 2016 in the United States, I decided that I would throw my hat into the political ring and prepare to run for Congress in the 2018 elections. And my reason was that I felt that in the United States, there were fundamental, bold proposals that no one was putting forward that were necessary to give capitalism a human face, to secure the kinds of social rights without which democracy itself cannot function. Now, I want to discuss some of this and discuss the impact for business of the proposals I'm intending to advance, and also to discuss to what extent they have applicability to India, as well as the United States. As you know, we share certain things in common. As a citizen of the United States, as citizens of India, we both come from nations that were British colonies. We come from nations that are the largest democracies in human history. The United States has the oldest operative constitution, even though we are, of course, a much younger nation than India. Our constitution is perhaps the shortest. It contains only 7 articles and 27 amendments. By contrast, India's is the longest constitution in the world, with well over 100 amendments. Now, I think there are significant differences that in some respect reflect both limitations of the American Constitution and certain political recognitions that occurred in the 20th century that had an impact on how constitutions were formulated after the Second World War. The American Constitution confines itself to spelling out the structure of our representative democracy and spelling out the kind of civil rights that individuals have as equal under the law and as equal participants in the democratic process. The American Constitution has almost nothing to say about the family and what's rights and duties apply to family members and the relationship of family life to life in society and state. It also says almost nothing about social relationships and what social rights and duties one might have. When the American Constitution was established, its founders misinterpreted and misapplied that Constitution in the following way. The Constitution itself spoke of the rights of men without really explicitly limiting them to any particular groups, but in practice, from the very outset of the American Republic, the only individuals who could count on being able to exercise all of the rights specified in the American Constitution were men who were white and who had a certain amount of property. Now, there have been more than 2 centuries of civil rights struggles to eliminate these restrictions on the exercise of rights and to allow the rights specified in the Constitution to be consistently embraced and consistently enforced, so that they no longer are privileges of a certain group, but rather extend to all adult citizens. As these civil rights struggles have become more and more successful, it has become more and more evident that the rights specified in the American Constitution, the civil and political rights, are not sufficient to provide the basis for an abiding democracy in which individuals can exercise their household and social freedoms with sufficient equality to be able to participate as equals in political life. The United States has become the most unequal developed nation. The richest 1% have as much wealth as the bottom 90%. 25% of all Americans have no net worth or negative net worth. 75% of all Americans are only $700 away from a financial disaster. Almost half of all American children are growing up in poverty. And now the United States has the least social mobility of any developed nation. Now, currently, there is a lot of recognition that this situation is only going to get worse because of an accelerating assault on the full-time job. And this assault is coming from 2 directions. One is the continuing advance of automation, and the other is the rise of the so-called gig economy. Now, automation, of course, has gained its greatest success in the United States in agriculture. It wasn't that long ago, maybe a century or more, that the vast majority of Americans earned a living off the land, as one would have to say the majority of Indians today earn a living off the land. Today, thanks to mechanization in agriculture, agricultural output is at an all-time high, both in actual amounts of produce and the value of the produce. And yet, less than 1.5% of American wage earners work in agriculture. Something similar has happened in manufacturing in the United States. Currently, manufacturing proper, which is again at an all-time high in the value of its production and in the amount of its production, nevertheless only employs about 6% of the workforce. Now, many have spoken, and particularly people like Trump, have spoken of how the decline in manufacturing employment in the United States is due to outsourcing to places like India or to Mexico. There is some truth to a decline in manufacturing employment in the United States being due to outsourcing. About 15% of the decline in manufacturing employment in the US is due to outsourcing, but 85% of it is due to automation. And now automation is poised to take on the area where most of us work, namely the service sector, where in the United States today, 86% of wage earners earn their living. And it's estimated that in the coming 20 years, almost 50% of employment in the service sector will be replaced by various forms of automation. Compounding these developments is the rapid march of the so-called gig economy, where developments in technology and the internet are allowing manufacturers to cease employing people in an actual work environment with infrastructure and so forth, and to simply find people to do particular tasks anywhere in the world at any time, farming them out over the internet in various ways. And although many people regard themselves as little entrepreneurs who engage in this kind of gig economy, contract work, and many are happy with the kind of flexibility it involves, it also involves a kind of isolation, disempowerment, and a loss of any guarantee of the amount of employment one has, let alone any benefits. Now, these assaults on full-time employment in the United States are particularly disastrous because the United States has failed, like most other developed nations, to guarantee fundamental social benefits from the side of the government. Instead, the United States has developed a system where much of, for example, our health insurance is something an individual has in connection with their employment. The viable pension that individuals have is in many respects tied to employment. And this is not because American employers are particularly generous. It's rather that their employees, at a time when there were strong unions, fought tooth and nail for these benefits. But what this means is with the destruction of a full-time job, one not only loses one's income, one also loses the associated benefits. Now, in facing these sort of problems, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the American president who presided over dealing with the Great Depression and World War II, towards the very end of his presidency in 1944, in his final address to Congress, he pointed out that in face of modern social and economic developments, the American Constitution was not sufficient to meet the problems that people faced. That we needed to have a new economic Bill of Rights that would ensure that everyone would have employment, everyone would have affordable housing, everyone would have health care, everyone would have a real pension, everyone would have access to education at all levels. Now, he did not live long enough to attempt to implement these rights. After his death, his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, presided over a committee of the new United Nations, which was drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And in that Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the rights that Roosevelt spoke of were presented in a series of articles. And as you probably all know, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights with only a few abstentions, and those abstentions were the Soviet Union and its satellite nations, the Union of South Africa, and Saudi Arabia. And one can think of why these would be the nations who refused to sign on to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. All the other nations did, including the United States and India. However, I think one can say that the rights in question have never been fully enforced by the signatories. Now, on the other hand, I think one has to admit that after World War II, when nations throughout the world were being reconstituted with new constitutions, most of these constitutions incorporated the kind of household and social rights that were articulated in the Universal Declaration of Rights. The Indian Constitution is a case in point. The 23rd article of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights calls for every adult to enjoy the right of having an employment sufficient to provide for their needs and the needs of their family. Article 41 of the Indian Constitution provides for a similar entitlement. Now, I want to argue myself that in the context of the United States, where the Constitution does not provide any such guarantees, the United States can only escape the growing inequality and the growing threat to democracy that that represents by embracing a series of new social rights that are recognized and enforced. And I want to show that the adoption of these social rights and their enforcement is anything but antithetical to the vitality of business. That not only is this a means of giving capitalism a human face, but it's also a means that will enhance economic growth and development. Now, fundamental to the social rights I have in mind, and most basic to them, is the right to work. That is the right of all able individuals, able and willing individuals, to have an employment at a fair wage. Now, we all know that the nature of competition is such that there are winners and losers. The losers are not going to be able to maintain all their labor force or to maintain them at full employment. Even the winners are going to have to continually refashion the way they produce their goods and services, alter their methods of production, entailing continual turmoil in labor markets. If everyone is really to have the fundamental basis of economic independence and security, of being able to actually have employment at a fair wage, government will have to step in and provide such employment when the market fails to do so. Government will have to be an employer of last resort. Now, to do that, of course, government cannot engage in the same productions of goods and services that private enterprise does. That would only increase overproduction, exacerbate the problem. So in a sense, if government is to step in, it has to engage in providing goods and services that profit-seeking enterprises are neither willing or able to provide. Now, of course, we might wonder, are there any such things? But I think if you look around both India and the United States, there are vast infrastructure projects that remain to be undertaken, infrastructure repairs that need to be made, transitions to a green infrastructure, transitions to broadband for all, provisions of all sorts of public transportation, provisions of all sorts of care and services that are not being affordably provided by the market. And these can provide for employment that will not only allow for everyone to be at work, but also to provide added social capital that will be of aid to the economic welfare of all. And if you think about it, you can see that in a certain respect, guaranteeing full employment through government intervention is something that will be fundamentally beneficial to business, because it will provide the maximal consumer demand. And it will, in many respects, mitigate against the fluctuations in business cycles where consumer demand will rise and fall as unemployment rises and falls. Well, if you have guaranteed employment at a fair wage, those kind of fluctuations are kept in check, which means that business opportunities will not be as subject to the kinds of ups and downs that leave massive amounts of capital underused, underutilized, and subject to destruction of value. Now, in a way, you can see that if one were to undertake such a project, it might be thought to have a kind of self-limiting character, because by enhancing consumer demand, and in some respect, providing for business opportunities, it would allow employment to grow, and thereby diminish the need for increased interventions on the part of the public. Now, one might ask, is such a thing possible? Is it really possible for government to undertake such a vast engagement in producing so many different sorts of goods and services that can make use of all the different talents of everyone who might be unemployed? Well, there are two historical examples that show to some degree how this is feasible. One is in the United States and the other is in India. That of the United States is something that was undertaken during the Great Depression, starting in 1935, when with the Works Progress Administration under President Roosevelt, more than 8.5 million people were put to work, building some of the greatest public works projects in the United States history, producing innumerable school buildings, public hospitals, libraries, parks, national parks, artistic performances of all sorts. It was really a flowering both of public investment and cultural opportunities. And it took place when the United States had only 125 million people, not the 325 million it has today. It took place when the United States had only 6% of the national wealth it has today. And it took place, of course, at a time when the United States was undergoing its greatest economic crisis in its history. Now, this was undertaken as an emergency measure, but I think one can look at it as an example of what could be regarded as a standing fixture of a free and just society, of a market society in which one could say that capitalism has a human face. Now, the example of India that I had in mind is in some respects more massive and yet more limited. And I have in mind the Mahatma Gandhi Rural Employment Guarantee Act, which, as you know, puts about 55 million people to work for 100 days each year in the countryside. Now, obviously, that's limited. It's not putting everyone to work who needs a job and giving them employment around the year. But it's an example of a kind of employment program that can provide a basis of economic independence and security. And if one asks how are these things to be funded, I think one can regard the funding for these and all similar projects as being something that need not be a burden on corporations. In fact, one could even think of eliminating all corporate taxes whatsoever. One can instead think of putting the burden of taxation on private wealth and private income. And in particular on private wealth. If you take the United States currently has the greatest accumulation of private wealth in human history. It amounts to almost $90 trillion. By comparison, India has something between $3 and $4 trillion in private wealth. I've mentioned already how the private wealth in the United States is very unequally distributed. The top 1% have 38% of the private wealth in the United States. In India, the top 1% have 58% of the national wealth. And as you can imagine, in both cases, this tremendous concentration of wealth at the high end signifies that vast amounts of capital are sitting unused because they can't be consumed by those who possess them. And that means that if we were to tap these vast reserves and put them to work by using them for public works projects to guarantee full employment, they will be used to provide income to people who will spend much more of their income than those at the upper end. So it's sort of the opposite of trickle-down economics. Trickle-down economics wants to say, well, we cut taxes on the rich, and that is somehow going to provide economic vitality, greater job growth, and so forth. But in some respect, it means that we have a more and more unequal society. And with these greater accumulations of wealth at the top, more and more capital is sitting unused. If you look at the example in the United States, in the recent recession, American corporations were aflush with vast amounts of cash. But they were not willing to invest it in added production. So what did they do with their cash? They engaged in mergers and acquisitions, where they bought back their own stock. They couldn't engage in further production because there was not effective consumer demand to absorb whatever new production they would engage in. Why? Well, partly because not everyone was employed. Now, when we talk about a measure like this of guaranteed employment, I think we want to think about it as setting a lower level for the livelihood of all members of society. That is, if we're going to speak about guaranteed employment, the fair wage that should involve should be that which would count as a new fair minimum wage. And it should also be the equivalent of the support that individuals get who are unable to work because of disabilities, or who are unable to work because of old age. So in a sense, we're speaking about a level of replacement income, which will be equivalent to what the new fair minimum wage would be. Now obviously, what the bottom floor can be depends upon the wealth of the society and the productivity of its economy. In the United States, I am proposing as a new fair minimum wage $20 an hour. Now the current minimum wage in the United States is $7.25. It's been at that level for more than a decade, and most observers would say that it's not possible to live on $7.25 an hour in the United States in any kind of decent manner, given the price structure that people have to deal with. In 1968, the minimum wage was $1.60 per hour. If you adjust that for inflation, it comes to $10.50 per hour. If you adjust it also for productivity gains, because the economy has continued to become more and more productive, it comes to $22 per hour. Now in the United States, from 1945 until 1973, wages rose in tandem with the increase in productivity. And because of that, there was a steady increase in the standard of living for broad portions of the population. In 1973, because of various political developments, because of weakening in the trade union movement, wages began to stagnate. Productivity continued to rise, but wages remained the same. And what that means is as wages stagnate and productivity rises, the proportion of the national wealth that goes to employees diminishes more and more. In fact, it is now at its lowest historical level in American history. And that means, on the other side, that American society has become more and more unequal. And more wealth is now concentrated at the top. And not surprisingly, instead of this move to the top producing greater economic vitality, the growth rate of the American economy is half of what it was before 1973. And I think that reflects this basic feature of the economic dynamic. That extreme inequality is not something that fosters economic growth. It is something that rather hinders economic growth, because it ensures that large amounts of capital remain holed up in unproductive investments, instead of falling into the hands of individuals who will spend most of their income on what they need to survive. Well, you can think yourselves about what would be involved in trying to have a scheme of genuine guaranteed employment in India. Obviously, it's very challenging. What the new platform would be, that would be the minimum, obviously depends upon the level of productivity and the national wealth. But again, I think you can think of the basic dynamic involved. Not only does it provide a level of economic independence and security that would otherwise absent, it also provides a basis for an increase in consumer demand and greater economic vitality. Now, there's another side of things that I want to bring up that is not itself answered by simply guaranteeing employment and ensuring a fair minimum wage. And that has to do with the relation between employer and employee. Now, The dynamic of markets is such that there is inevitably an imbalance in the power of employers and employees for the following reason. Competition requires enterprises to grow in order to survive. They have to increase their capital to be able to engage in the product development, the efficiencies of scale and so forth that allow them to compete. And what that means is inevitably there are going to be far more employees than there are employers. And that imbalance has consequences for the opportunities one has to earn a living. Right? One's options at employment, if one is an employee, are less than the options one has as an employer, generally speaking, to find employees. And if you think of the way in which businesses operate, particularly in the United States, the dominant form of economic organization is the share issuing corporation. And it's no accident that that is the case. Precisely because an enterprise can be more competitive the more capital it has at its disposal. An individual is limited to the capital they have or that they can borrow. A family may have a wider expanse of capital. A municipality may be able to use tax revenues to provide for capitalization. But a public share issuing corporation can raise capital from anywhere in the world. And in that regard, it's no accident that the development of business leads in the direction of share issuing public corporations. Now, the way they're operating currently in a place like the United States is that the board of directors, which is supposedly elected by shareholders, is by and large in cahoots with the CEO. They operate as one, and it's no surprise that in the United States, CEOs are now getting 325 times the amount of money that the average employee gets in their firm, to a greater degree than anywhere else in the world. And it reflects the facts that corporate governance operates in a way where it's only the upper echelon of the corporation, of management and ownership, that has any say. Employees have no say whatsoever. So if we want to balance the field between employer and employee, not give any predominance to one or the other, I would propose that we do something that has been adopted in certain European countries. That is, we introduce what could be called employee co-determination, where we require that the boards of directors of corporations have 50% of their members drawn from non-managerial employees elected from their peers. Now, you want to consider what would that mean? Well, on the one hand, it would mean that corporations are not going to make the same kind of decisions they're currently making regarding outsourcing, regarding forms of automation, regarding executive compensations. Because in many respects, these decisions will now have to reflect some input on the part of employees. The same can be said about what decisions corporations will make with regard to how they treat consumers, how they treat the environment, how they intervene in the political process. There would be a certain taming in the sense that now two interests would be represented in the workings of corporations. And it's not clear that if this were to be mandated on an industry-wide basis, this would put any business at a competitive disadvantage. On the other hand, there's another side of it regarding the way in which one can balance the relation of employee and employer. And that is regarding negotiations between the two. In the United States currently, the labor movement is at its lowest nadir. It is at its weakest state that it has been in my lifetime. Now only 6% of employees in the private sector are unionized, which is to say that in almost all employee situations, employees have really no say. They have a situation where it's essentially take it or leave it. And the procedures that have been put in place by law to enable employees to unionize have proved to be ineffective. Unions are failing to further organize. And all the new industries, all the great tech giants, whether it's Amazon or Apple, they're all completely non-union. And although the upper echelons in Apple and Amazon may become millionaires or billionaires in their own right through their stock dividends and so forth, most of the employees in these firms are getting very low wages with very little benefits and no input whatsoever. The United States is moving to become more and more of a low-wage society, despite the fact that there's growing accumulation on the part of these kind of businesses. So again, these would be ways of working within the structure of corporations to try to establish a fair balance. And again, if you think of how this would allow the economy to provide a greater degree of equity among different parties, I think one can also see how this can be a basis for greater economic growth and development. Now there's one other factor I want to bring in, and that is a relationship of livelihood and family. Because even if one has guaranteed employment, even if one has some say in one's workplace, one can't really partake of employment if doing so requires that one abandons one's family responsibilities. And this is particularly true when in a country like the United States, where nuclear families predominate, where there are many single parents, and where most families have both spouses working. People have to make a decision that is not a decision one would want anyone to have to make. They have to decide whether they're going to seek employment or stay home to care for children or elders. Why? Because the costs of getting child care and elder care are prohibitive. So if we are going to allow livelihood and family to operate in harmony, we have to make certain fundamental adjustments. Part of it has to do with how the work routine is organized. So I would suggest something that the United States, unlike most developed nations, has not done. Namely, we need to mandate that there be at least a 1-month paid vacation for all employees. There ought to be a 9-month paid parental leave for parents when a newborn comes into the country. I mean, almost all other nations have it, but the United States, in its greedy callousness, has refused to take these measures. On the other hand, if one is going to be able to avail of working when one has children, one needs to have free public daycare. Just as the United States, once upon a time, decided to have free public education without having any means test, without dividing people into haves and have-nots, the same approach could be taken to child care and also elder care, because the costs of taking care of the elderly who are getting older and older, who may require at the end of life several years of 24-hour care, this again make it impossible for their families to continue working and take care of elders. So something has to be done. Society has to step in a public way and provide for this. And likewise, it's not enough to supply guaranteed employment and a fair living wage, because you have different needs depending upon how many children you have. So to remedy the problem of childhood poverty, which is a shameful problem in the United States, which has the greatest wealth of any nation in human history, I'm proposing something other nations have done, namely we have a child allowance of $500 per month per child that goes to every parent. And this way one can remove the specter of childhood poverty. Now these are some measures that deal with ways in which we can humanize the workings of the marketplace. None of them involve nationalizations. None of them involve restricting the operations of business. They rather involve subjecting society at large to certain requirements, which, because they are universal, because they apply to all entrepreneurs, put none of them at a competitive disadvantage. And I'd like to suggest these as parts of a new social bill of rights that I think has a universal applicability. Obviously, how such measures are implemented depends upon the resources of every respective nation. But I don't think that the great differences in wealth among nations is itself a reason for precluding these kind of policies from being instituted. So I put them before you as measures for redeeming capitalism, for allowing entrepreneurs to be ethical and competitive, and for allowing our society to have a kind of freedom and equality where everyone enjoys economic independence and security and can participate in self-government.